There is a narrative that persists across the internet. It speaks of a hidden realm somewhere beneath the great Smoky Mountains. Not a cavern, not a disused mine shaft, but an entire society. Whole thoroughfares, entire structures, all consumed in a single calamity that mainstream history supposedly elected to overlook. The tale advances one step further, alleging that the Cherokee people documented this event sometime around the year 1888, and that this record was quietly expunged before the broader public could ever peruse it. It is a compelling notion. It seizes your imagination and refuses to let go. Yet when you genuinely set out to locate that 1888 manuscript, you encounter something more peculiar than the myth itself, because a real individual was indeed residing among the Cherokee during those exact years, meticulously transcribing everything they chose to share with him. And what he documented concerning these highlands, concerning silt, concerning a population that vanished into the earth, is authentic. It survives. I have to pause momentarily because what I have just outlined represents one instance from a considerably more extensive pattern. There are 35 verified occurrences in a compilation I have assembled. Distinct municipalities, varying eras, disparate forms of proof. Every single one follows the identical progression. Discovered, recorded, obtained, vanished. I could not incorporate all of it into one presentation. It is accessible via the pinned remark below. Examine it before we proceed. It simply is not the narrative the internet is peddling. So today we are going to undertake something the legend never attempts. We are going to investigate firsthand. Let us begin with the hypothesis, because you have likely encountered fragments of it without recognizing what it was. Scroll sufficiently through certain niches of the web and you will stumble upon it. They term it the mud flood. The concept is straightforward, and that simplicity is part of why it proliferates so rapidly. Somewhere in the recent past, perhaps 200 years ago, perhaps less, a worldwide cataclysm interred the ground levels of structures across the globe in a surge of mire and sediment. Proponents point to antiquated European houses with windows partially submerged beneath contemporary pavement. They highlight grand railway stations and courthouses that appear excessively ornate, excessively vast for the modest populations that supposedly erected them. And they connect it all to a vanished dominion, an advanced civilization they named Tartaria, erased from cartography and expunged from academic curricula. It sounds preposterous when articulated aloud, and much of it is. However, here is the uncomfortable reality regarding the mud flood theory. It endures not because the evidence is compelling, but because the sentiment is. Every one of us has strolled through an aged district of a city and experienced it. That quiet intuition that those who preceded us constructed something we could not replicate today, that something has been forfeited. The hypothesis seizes that sensation, that ache, and presents you with an antagonist and a date, and it arrives with an entire apparatus of proof, if you can call it that. Believers reference the grand world's fairs of the late 1800s, those immense ivory cities of cupolas and pillars that were erected for a single season and subsequently demolished. They question how a civilization could erect marble palaces overnight and then simply dismantle them. They discuss a great reset, a moment when the timeline was revised and the survivors were fed a counterfeit history and informed it had perpetually been this way. They gather vintage photographs of half-buried windows, mismatched masonry and vacant oversized boulevards, and they assemble them into an argument. None of it withstands genuine scrutiny. The World's Fair edifices were temporary by intention, constructed from plaster over wooden armatures, never meant to endure. The sunken windows are the consequence of municipalities elevating their street grades over time, which is mundane and thoroughly documented. But scrutiny is sluggish, and a compelling photograph is swift, and the theory perpetually advances because it never has to halt and substantiate anything. It only has to make you perceive the deprivation. And of all the locations this theory has fastened onto, few match the atmosphere better than the Smokies. Contemplate what these mountains actually resemble on an ordinary morning. Before the sun disperses it, the entire range exhales. A pale azure vapor rises directly from the foliage and gathers in the valleys, dense enough to obscure a whole settlement. The Cherokee possessed a designation for this place long before the tourists arrived. They called it Shakonage, the territory of the blue smoke. The Europeans merely translated the impression and retained the name. That smoke is real, and there is a genuine explanation for it. The woodland here ranks among the densest and most varied in all of North America. This stands as one of the great strongholds of temperate life on the planet. Thousands of species of flora and fauna crowd into these slopes. So many varieties of salamander that biologists occasionally refer to the Smokies as the salamander capital of the world. So many trees and blossoms and mosses layered upon one another that scientists are still cataloging species here that exist nowhere else. All that living matter emits organic compounds into the atmosphere, and those compounds scatter the light and impart the rising haze with its blue hue. It is chemistry. It is beautiful, ordinary chemistry. The sheer weight of life exhaling simultaneously. But comprehending the science does not extinguish the feeling. Stand at a viewpoint at dawn. Observe the fog engulf an entire valley until only the summits of the ridges show. And some primal segment of your brain whispers the same thing it whispered to everyone who ever stood here. Something down there is concealed. Something down there is obscured. The theory feeds on that whisper, and it discovers more to work with the deeper you delve, because the Smokies do enter things. That aspect is not a legend, it is simply accurate, and it transpires on a scale that surprises people. The soil here is profound and ancient and ravenous. Leave a cabin vacant for 50 years in these highlands, and the forest does not merely grow around it, it grows over it. Moss claims the roof, roots fracture the foundation. Leaf litter accumulates against the walls year after year, decade after decade, until the floor of the building rests below the floor of the woodland. Return a generation later, and you might walk directly over the roofline of a home and never know a family once lived and perished there. There exists a version of an interred civilization in these mountains. It is real, it is recorded, and we are going to address it. But it is not the one the internet promised. To locate it, we must meet the man who genuinely wrote things down. His name was James Mooney. In the late 1880s, while mud flood proponents imagined some grand catastrophe being chronicled and concealed, a young ethnographer from the Bureau of American Ethnology packed his belongings and ventured into the highlands of western North Carolina to reside among the eastern band of the Cherokee. This was the community that had refused to depart. Decades earlier, the majority of the Cherokee Nation had been compelled westward at gunpoint, along the route we now designate the Trail of Tears. But a tenacious remainder had concealed themselves in these very ridges and hollows, in the shadow of the blue smoke, and clung to the only homeland they had ever known. Mooney did something that was rare for his time. He paid attention. He acquired sufficient command of the language to follow the elders when they conversed. He sat with the medicine keepers, the storytellers, the last individuals alive who carried traditions that extended back centuries before any European set foot on the continent, and he recorded it all, page after page after page. The work he produced, published as The Myths of the Cherokee, stands as one of the most comprehensive records we possess of how these people understood the world and the mountains they inhabited. So, here is the candid truth about that 1888 document. There exists no secret Cherokee account of a mud flood being suppressed by the government. That component is fabricated. But the era is accurate. The location is accurate. A man genuinely was preserving Cherokee memory in those exact years, and what he uncovered regarding mud and buried worlds is genuinely stranger than the fiction. Because listen to how the Cherokee described the world's beginning. In the beginning, they informed Mooney, there was no land at all, only water stretching in every direction and a sky vault of solid rock arching over it. All the animals lived above, crowded together in the world beyond the sky, and it was becoming too cramped. They desired space. They wished to know if anything solid existed below the endless water. So a small creature volunteered, the water beetle. In the Cherokee telling, it is called Dunsea, the beaver's grandchild. It darted down and skimmed across the surface of the water, seeking solid ground, and discovered none. Then it dove downward into the dark water until it reached the bottom, and when it re-emerged, it bore something on its back, soft mud. That mud began to expand. It spread across the surface of the water in every direction until it became an island. That island is the earth. And in the oldest Cherokee understanding, the entire world, the ground beneath your feet at this very moment, was drawn up from deep water as a handful of wet mud that simply kept growing. Pause and reflect on that for a moment. Before there was a printing press, before there was a mud flood video, before any of it, the people of these mountains were already recounting a story in which the land itself is composed of mud that rose from a flood of water. The internet did not uncover that connection. It stumbled into the fringe of something the Cherokee had preserved for an extensive period, and then it misinterpreted the details entirely. And the narrative does not conclude there. It becomes more localized. The mud island was new, the Cherokee said, and it was soft, too soft and too wet to stand upon. So the animals continued sending birds to check whether it had dried sufficiently to inhabit, and each time the birds returned and reported that the ground was still damp. Finally, they dispatched the great buzzard, the grandfather of all the buzzards we see today. He flew low over the new earth, back and forth, searching for dry land, but it was a lengthy journey, and his wings grew weary. And as he passed over the country that would one day belong to the Cherokee, his great wings began to strike the soft ground. Every time a wingtip descended, it carved a valley. Every time it swept upward, it raised a mountain. The other animals, observing from above, grew fearful. If the buzzard persisted, the entire world would become nothing but mountains, so they summoned him back. But it was too late for this particular stretch of the earth. The damage, if you choose to call it that, was already done. And that, the Cherokee told James Mooney in the 1880s, is why the Cherokee country is so replete with mountains to this very day. Contemplate what that actually signifies. In the tradition of the people who resided here longest, these ridges and hollows, these exact peaks draped in blue smoke, were sculpted into existence when the earth was still wet mud, not buried by mud in a catastrophe, but shaped from it at the very outset by the wings of a weary old bird flying too close to the ground. That is the obscured truth the legend walked straight past. The real story is not concealed in a government vault. It was published over a century ago, and it is more exquisite than the fiction. And the creation story was only the commencement of what Mooney collected. The Cherokee informed him about the giants who once dwelt in these ranges. The greatest of them was a being they called Tulkutu, which the settlers later softened into the name Judah. He was a giant of the high country, slant-eyed, the master of all game animals, and he resided in the deep mountains where no one dared to hunt without his permission. He was said to be so immense that he could step from ridge to ridge, and that the marks of his passage were pressed into the very stone of the mountains. Here is where the tradition reaches out and touches something you can still go and place your hand upon. In Jackson County, North Carolina, on the edge of the old Cherokee country, there is a boulder of soapstone lying in a field. It is covered edge to edge in carvings, curling lines, figures, shapes that no one alive can fully interpret, cut into the rock by humans so long ago that archaeologists measure their age in thousands of years. The Cherokee called it the place where Tulkutu came down from his mountain, and they say one set of markings is the print of the giant's hand where he braced himself as he leapt. They call it Judaculla Rock. It is real, you can visit it, and it stands as a genuine record left in stone by people whose full narrative we will never completely recover. Sitting quietly in the same mountains the internet swears are concealing a lost civilization. The lost writing is real. It simply is not the writing anyone was seeking. Mooney recorded something else as well, something that cuts even closer to the legend. The Cherokee possessed a flood tradition of their own. In it, a man is warned by his faithful dog that a great inundation is coming to drown the world, and he survives by constructing a raft and riding out the rising water while everything familiar disappears beneath it. A deluge, a world washed away and remade. It is a story told by cultures all over the earth, and the Cherokee were no exception. So when someone asserts that the Cherokee spoke of a great flood, they are not entirely mistaken. The Cherokee did carry a flood story. It simply has nothing to do with mud burying the Smokies in 1888, and everything to do with the oldest kind of memory a people can hold now. Here is where a meticulous person must pause and pose an honest question. Is any of this connected to the real geology of these mountains? Because it would be easy to become carried away. And the entire point of genuinely investigating is that we do not become carried away. So let us examine what the science says. And the science, in its own way, is equally humbling. The Appalachians, the mountain family to which the Smokies belong, rank among the oldest mountains on the entire planet. We are not discussing thousands of years, we are discussing hundreds of millions. These ranges were rising and colliding and folding before there were dinosaurs, before there were flowers, before life had truly filled the land at all. When geologists reconstruct what these mountains once were, the figure they arrive at is genuinely hard to comprehend. The ancient Appalachians are believed to have stood as tall as the Alps. Some estimates push them toward the scale of the Himalayas. Look at the Smokies now, soft, rounded, green, gentle. Nothing about them resembles the roof of the world. Before I proceed further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now. Because everything I cover in these presentations is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document reveals the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What lies beneath is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then return, and that is the point. Everything that made them tall has been descending for hundreds of millions of years. Rain and ice and root and river have been grinding those peaks apart, grain by grain, and carrying the fragments downhill and depositing them into the valleys for longer than the human mind can truly process. The soft, deep soil under this forest is the ground-up bones of mountains that once scraped the sky. So when the Cherokee said the land here was shaped when the earth was soft, they were not composing a geology textbook, but they were not entirely mistaken about the character of the place either. This is a landscape defined by things wearing down, settling, filling in and burying what came before. That is not a catastrophe theory. That is simply what these mountains are and have always been. And here is where the legend acquires its most potent ammunition. Because these mountains really do generate their own mud floods. Not a global one, not a concealed one, but real, violent, local ones. They are called debris flows. When a heavy rain persists over these steep slopes for long enough, the saturated soil on a mountainside can simply let go. And when it lets go, it does not slide politely, it liquefies soil, rock, entire trees, everything on the slope collapses into a single churning wave of mud and descends downhill with terrifying speed and force. It can strip a mountainside down to bare rock. It can rearrange a valley in minutes. It can bury whatever sits at the bottom under a wall of earth and stone and shattered timber. People who reside in these mountains know this. It is inscribed into the landscape if you know how to interpret it. Those long, pale scars you sometimes observe, running straight down a green ridge, are the tracks where the mountain gave way and slid, and if you look closely, you can often perceive the pile of debris fanned out at the bottom, where it finally came to rest. That fan represents a burial. Whatever was there before now lies beneath it. And in the worst storms, in the worst years, these flows have swept away roads, torn out bridges, buried homes, and claimed lives. In living memory, on ground people know by name, the mud flood is not a myth here. It is a weather event. It occurs on a Tuesday. It is just a great deal smaller and a great deal more real than the version featuring the Lost Empire. And the people who have watched a hillside descend in the darkness do not require a conspiracy to explain what mud can do to whatever stands beneath it. So the raw materials of the legend are all present. Mountains that enter things, a forest that engulfs buildings, fog that conceals entire valleys, real mud that genuinely comes down and covers what lies below it, and an ancient tradition about land pulled from a flood and shaped while it was still soft. You can perceive exactly how a person could stitch all of that together into a story about a buried world. The pieces are genuine. It is only the conclusion that is fabricated. But we still have not discovered the buried people. And that is the part that matters most, because there is a buried people in this story. Two of them, actually. One belongs to legend. One belongs to history. And the history is the one that should stop you cold. Let us address the legend first, because the Cherokee themselves told Mooney about a hidden people in these mountains. They called them the Nunahi. The name means something close to the people who live anywhere, or the immortals. In the old Cherokee understanding, the Nunahi were a race of spirit people who dwelled inside these mountains, under the peaks, beneath the blue smoke, hidden in the high places where no ordinary person could find them. They were not ghosts. They were not adversaries. They were an entire society living and thriving just out of sight, beneath the ground the Cherokee walked on every day. Travelers recounted stories of hearing them. A hunter alone in the high country would detect drums and dancing and singing emanating from the mountain from a townhouse he could never quite locate. Sometimes the Nunahi were said to appear to lost or freezing travelers, to guide them home, to feed them, to save them, and then to vanish. And in the darkest chapters of Cherokee history, when the people faced devastation, some traditions maintain that the Nunahi offered to take them in, to allow entire towns to descend into the mountain and live forever, safe beneath the earth. There is a buried civilization in the Cherokee tradition of these mountains. It is the Nunahi, and it was never lost because it was never meant to be found. It was always down there in the story, living under the same blue smoke in a world beneath the world. Now hold that image, the idea of a whole people disappearing into these mountains to survive, and turn from the legend to the record because it happened. Not with spirits, but with families, with names. By the 1830s, the Cherokee were one of the largest and most established nations in the Southeast. They had towns, they had farms, they had a written language invented by a Cherokee man named Sequoyah, and they printed a newspaper in it. By the standards the United States claimed to value, they had built exactly the kind of settled, literate society they were supposedly being asked to become. And it did not save them, because there was gold in the southern mountains, and there was land, and the people who wanted both possessed the power to take them. What followed stands as one of the darkest acts in the country's history. The Cherokee Nation, along with other southeastern nations, were forced from their homelands and marched more than 1,000 miles west to territory that is now Oklahoma. Thousands perished on the journey, from cold, from hunger, from disease, from sheer exhaustion and grief. The Cherokee remember it as Nunadastani, the trail where they cried. History remembers it as the Trail of Tears. That is your buried civilization. It is not hidden under mud. It was carried off at gunpoint, and an entire built world, an entire way of life rooted in these mountains for centuries, was emptied out in a matter of years. If you are searching for a great people who were here, who built and farmed and wrote and worshipped, and who were then erased from the land almost overnight, you do not need a lost empire. You do not need Tartaria. You have the Cherokee, and it is not a theory. It is written down in painful detail in the records of the government that perpetrated it. But remember the remnant. Remember the ones who refused. When the soldiers came to round up the Cherokee, not everyone departed. In these mountains, in the highest and most difficult and most concealed country, a group of Cherokees slipped away from the roundup and vanished into the ridges. They hid in the caves and the laurel thickets and the deep hollows, exactly the kind of terrain where the Nunahi were said to live, and the mountains sheltered them. The same folded, fog-drowned, impassable terrain that makes these peaks feel as though they are concealing something is the terrain that enabled a people to disappear into it and endure. They became the eastern band of the Cherokee. They are still here, and a generation later it was their elders that James Mooney sat with, and it was their memory that he inscribed into the pages we can still read today. The story survived because the people survived. They went into the mountains like the old tradition said, and the mountains kept them, and they were not the last people these mountains would swallow. There is a second buried world in the Smokies, more recent, and its bones are still standing if you know where to walk. Long after the Cherokee were driven out, settlers moved into these coves and hollows and built lives of their own. Places with names like Cades Cove and Cataloochee and Elkmont filled with farms and churches and schools and mills. Whole communities generations deep grew up under the blue smoke. Then in the early part of the last century, the decision was made to transform these mountains into a national park, and to create that park the people residing within its boundaries had to depart. Some sold willingly. Many did not and were removed regardless. their land taken and their homes emptied. When the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was established, a living, working landscape of human beings was quietly cleared out of it, and the forest was permitted to reclaim everything they left behind. Go there now, and you will find it. Cabins standing alone among the trees, with no road remaining to reach them. A white church in a clearing with a graveyard beside it, and no congregation for miles. Chimneys rising from the undergrowth where a house once stood, the house itself long gone. Rotted and sunk into the very soil we discussed at the outset, the hungry ground that grows over anything you abandon. It is not a lost empire, it is not a cover-up, but it is, without any exaggeration, a buried world. People lived there. Then they were gone, and the mountains covered the evidence exactly the way the mountains always do. So let us return to where we began and be honest about what we have discovered. The internet promised us a documented Cherokee record of a mud flood burying the Smokies in 1888, concealed by people who did not want us to know, and that specific thing does not exist. There is no secret report. There is no cover-up of a catastrophe. That version is fiction wearing the costume of history. But consider everything the search actually yielded along the way. A real man in that real era writing down real Cherokee tradition. A creation story in which the entire earth is mud, pulled up out of a flood of water. A telling in which these exact mountains were shaped while the ground was still soft. A landscape that genuinely submerges buildings. That genuinely produces walls of mud when the rains arrive. And that is genuinely built from the ground-down remains of mountains that once rivaled the Himalayas. A tradition of a whole civilization living hidden beneath these peaks. And a true history of a great nation that really was erased from this land, and a remnant that truly did escape by disappearing into the mountains themselves. The legend is not true, but it is not empty either. It is a distorted echo. It is what transpires when a real feeling, the feeling that these mountains are concealing something, that a world has been lost here, becomes separated from the real story that gave it life. Someone sensed the weight of these hollows and reached for a lost empire, when the real lost world was right there in the record the entire time, more human and more heartbreaking than any invented one. That is worth contemplating the next time you encounter one of these theories. The mud flood, Tartaria, all of it. The people who adhere to them are not usually pursuing a lie for its own sake. They are pursuing a feeling. The feeling that something real and great came before us and was taken away, quietly, by forces that did not want us to remember. And the strange, sad truth is that in these particular mountains, under this particular blue smoke, that feeling is directed at something real. It is simply not directed where they suppose. There is a strange mercy in how this resolves if you sit with it. The people who propagate the mud flood story are reaching for a lost world, and they are reaching in the wrong direction, past the real one toward an empire that never existed. But the reaching itself is not irrational. It is human. We know, somewhere deep down, that the ground we stand on is thick with people who came before us, and that most of them have been forgotten, and that forgetting feels like a wound even when we cannot name whose it is. These mountains hold two buried worlds that we can actually prove, a nation carried off along a trail of tears, and a scattering of mountain communities cleared out and left to the forest. Both were real, both were covered over. Both are still here if you are willing to look at the difficult version instead of the exciting one. The tragedy is not that the truth was hidden. The tragedy is that the truth is sorrowful, and a lost empire is thrilling. And people would rather feel thrilled than feel grief. The buried world is here. It always was. It is a people, not an empire. It is written down, not concealed, and you do not have to excavate for it. You only have to be willing to look at what actually happened, which is harder and stranger and far more worth remembering than any story about mud. The Eastern Band remains in these mountains today, still speaking the language Mooney once trained to follow, still carrying the stories that outlived the soldiers and the surveyors and every attempt to end them. The record he left is not a relic. It is a bridge back to voices that refuse to fall silent. The Cherokee said the land was born from mud, shaped soft by the wings of a tired old bird. They said giants once walked these ridges and left their handprints in the stone, and that a hidden people lived beneath these peaks and welcomed the desperate in. And when their own destruction came, a portion of them did exactly what the old story described. They went into the mountains, and the mountains, wrapped in their endless blue smoke, kept them safe and kept their memory long enough for us to finally sit still and listen. So the next time the blue smoke rises off these ridges and that old whisper begins in the back of your mind, the one that says something down there is hidden, do not reach for the empire. Reach for the truth, because the whisper is correct. Something is down there. Something was covered over. A world did end here and another one nearly did, and the proof is not buried in mud at all. It is standing in a field on a carved gray rock. It is written in the pages of a man who bothered to listen. It is walking around these mountains today, speaking a language that was supposed to be gone. The lost world of the Smokies was never lost. It was only waiting for someone to stop chasing the legend and start remembering the people.